Hey there, everybody. Brian King here. Welcome to another episode of the Stigma Free Zone, where we talk about all things mental health as it relates to parents, teens, professionals. And as the title says, we really want to remove the stigma and have conversations that teach other people that there is no shame in having mental illness or mental differences. It's about loving ourselves, about acceptance, and teaching the world that we're people too. And maybe in the end of the day, we're not all that different from each other. The person that I have before us today is somebody that I have an incredible amount of respect for. And I'm so grateful for the fact that she's joined us today. Her name is Lee Thomas. She's from somewheres up in Canada, that hopefully the weather is as nice as it is here in Illinois today. And she presents to schools around the provinces, around Canada, and she talks very openly and authentically about her own mental health challenges to educate the youth, the educators, and anybody else that will listen to her brilliant message. So without further ado, let's get to know Lee Thomas. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I loved that intro. I'm just like, I'm blushing.
Hey, it's my pleasure. We talked a little bit before we went live here. And one thing that is really problematic is people that are on the outside of the community have a lot of misinformation about what it's like to live with a mental illness or a mental difference. Because they believe one thing, like, well, I believe it's important to accept differences and it's important to just love people for who they are. And they mistakenly believe that the rest of the world will receive us the same way.
Yeah.
You're talking about disclosure. And when you confide in a friend that, hey, I have this difficulty, I have this difference, this diagnosis, whatever they call it, and you're afraid to speak out about it and be authentic and live your truth. And this friend who sees themselves as open-minded encourages you to let the cat out of the bag, believing that others will be as open and loving, as accepting as they are. And in your experience, Lee, that has not really been the case, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've been lucky and I've been unlucky. You know what I mean? I've been luckier than some and unluckier than some others. I know, because I, am part of the LGBTQ community as well as part of the mental health community. Mm-hmm. And that's something we see in both communities, this idea of, particularly with parents and family, this idea of, oh, tell your parents, oh, tell your family, if you're LGBTQ or if you have a mental health issue, because they are sure to accept you. And I wish that was true. And I was very lucky. Like, my parents accepted me as best as they knew how. They're still pretty old school and they have, struggled with some parts of that, but they accepted me as best as they knew how. But there's a lot of people out there, especially young people, who that's bad advice. Basically, like it's bad advice to just say, if you are honest about who you are, people will definitely accept you. I don't want to say no one will accept you, because there are people who will accept you, but I think we're putting youth in danger sometimes by saying you must be honest with your parents about this, otherwise, you're not being true to yourself. I think that whole idea of authenticity and being true to yourself has a lot of layers to it, and I don't think it should come necessarily at the expense of someone's safety.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing we discussed also is the rate at which kids in the LGBT community are kicked out of their house.
Yeah.
And there are services out there for kids, teenagers, young adults in the LGBT community who came out, were promptly kicked out, and are now homeless.
Yeah, and that's like a real problem. Like, I wish I knew the stats off the top of my head, but one of the things is that the stats are actually pretty hard to come by. I mean, especially here in Canada, we don't do very many surveys and very many kind of for example, there's a Trans Pulse survey, which was done in Ontario in, I want to say 2012, and then it was never replicated. Although I just found out yesterday on Twitter, they're going to be doing another survey of trans people in Canada, and they're doing it Canada-wide, and it's going to, kind of kick off in the next year or so. So that's super exciting, but we end up having, outdated stats and that sort of thing. But all the stats show us that, the majority of youth who are on the streets are LGBTQ in some way, right? And it's super sad that they can't, live their authentic lives with their parents and all that sort of stuff. But I think it again comes back to that really well-meaning, but ultimately misguided advice where it's like, if you are not being open about who you are 100% of the time, then you're not living authentically. Because I think you can live authentically while still keeping yourself safe.
Oh, absolutely. There's got to be that balance. And you can look at the homeless population and how many people that are homeless are also mentally ill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, huge number.
Who didn't get treatment. Some of them are veterans. Some of them are people that maybe they were in poor homes or homes with people that were ignorant, not understanding. They may have untreated bipolar. They could have depression. They could have ADHD. And because of difficulties with their behavior, people who are their caretakers just said, I can't handle you. Out you go.
And you can end up in like a really tricky situation because like you talked about, untreated bipolar disorder. And that's something I feel, I guess I have the authority to talk on as someone with bipolar disorder. But I think one of the things that we also need to address is that it can be a catch-22 where for me, like, I know Canada, universal healthcare, blah, 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 but we don't have universal pharmacare. And so often you'll be prescribed medications that you then have to pay out of pocket for if you don't have health insurance. And so that's the situation I was in for a while where my medication per month was costing about as much as my rent. And I was, thank goodness, in a position where I was able to afford that. And now I have health insurance, yay, because I'm in a different job. But so I was in a position where my medication was as much as my rent. And it's so easy to see how that could end up with me making the choice between, do I pay rent or do I get my medication? And I know what decision I would make. Like I would choose to keep a roof over my head, but I think that it would be reasonable for someone to make a different decision and say, you know what, like I'm going to keep taking this medication, but I can now no longer afford to make rent, or it's put me in a situation where I can't afford rent. And now, you end up in that situation where because you were being responsible about treating your mental illness, you still ended up in poverty. Like you can't win in capitalism, right? Like
well, I didn't realize that you guys didn't have pharmacare up there, and it's the same down here. You don't have. There are doctors willing to make deals with patients to save them some money, but good luck finding a pharmacy that'll do that.
Yeah.
If we didn't have insurance, I'd be paying over $400 a month per 30 days for each of my boys' ADHD meds.
Yeah.
That'd be close to $1,000 a month just to help them with their focus. So thank God for insurance. Now there are ways that you can manage ADHD without meds, but try managing something like clinical depression, off the chart anxiety and bipolar.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who did manage those things without medication for a number of years, and manage is misleading. As someone who lived with those things for a number of years without medication, it was not a good time. I know medication can get a really bad rap from a lot of different directions. There's kind of this, I guess, idea that a lot of people have. There's the stigma, right? Exactly. Mm-hmm. That medication somehow, makes you weak, or that it's the easy way out, or that, medication is going to turn you into a zombie or whatever. And like, if your medication turns you into a zombie, like you're taking the wrong medication. But for me, medication, even though I've been on some of the wrong ones and I've been on, a couple ones that had side effects I couldn't handle, ultimately it's like, what's kind of keeping me going. Right. And I think, especially people who don't have chronic illnesses really struggle with this idea that some people are going to be medicated for the rest of their lives. And and I just don't really see that as a problem. You know what I mean? Like I'm going to take medication for my asthma for the rest of my life and no one's like slapping my wrist about that. But as soon as I'm like, I've been on this antidepressant for several years and I take this mood stabilizer, people are like, shouldn't you be doing yoga? And it's like,
amen to that. People will take pills for their pain, but not their brain.
Yeah. And
somewhere there's this, I don't know where the idea started, but once you're talking above the neck, you're a quitter or you're weak or something. Everything else is okay. Tammy in the comments mentioned that there are some people that won't even seek the diagnosis because of the stigma. They'll live in denial of it, minimize it. And one of the things that still kind of irks me is when people minimize it. When you tell them you have ADHD, well, isn't everybody a little ADHD? No, there are specific criteria and there's a level of severity to it.
Yeah,
Like if you said that you have bipolar, well, I get a little moody sometimes too. Not the same thing.
yeah, I found that was a big thing because I got diagnosed with ADHD and depression long before I got diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Like a lot of people with bipolar disorder, I got diagnosed with other things first. And when I had the diagnosis of ADHD and depression, I got that a lot. I got like, well, it's whatever it was at that time, like 2013, everyone's depressed, blah, 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 blah.
It's the new fad.
Yeah, it's the new fad. It's just a cool thing that the kids are trying out these days. And then when I got diagnosed with bipolar disorder, it was like a squeak of the brakes. It was like, oh, that's like one of the bad ones, right? So it was this weird kind of dichotomy where on the one hand, being diagnosed with bipolar disorder carried a lot more stigma with it than some of the other mental health issues I've been diagnosed with. But on the other hand, I felt more validated because people weren't treating me like I was just overreacting. With bipolar disorder, they were like, oh, that one's real. Depression is just people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but bipolar disorder, you are now sick, right? So it's like, again, like you couldn't win, where it's like I'm either invalidated or I face all this extra stigma.
Yeah, I mean, that the comment, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, I just kind of had a realization about the stigma about treating things above your brain is because people have this illusion of control. And you have to be in control of your mind, control of your faculties. And if you lose any kind of control, then that's bad. And if you don't have control of your mood, if you don't have control of your thoughts, like with schizophrenia, or with really bad anxiety or ADHD, where your thoughts are racing and you can't control them, then you're crazy. So it's all about that illusion, when you and I both know that even in our more stable days, that control is just an illusion. And I don't care what you tell yourself.
Yeah, I think people, and we see this in so many areas, right? Where people like feeling as though they have control. I mean, we see this in areas even where people, there was a big thing I spend a lot of time on the internet. There was a big thing on Twitter the other day because one of the Jenners, I want to say Kylie, I might be wrong about that, is like
a billionaire or something.
Is on track to be a billionaire, right? Yeah. Or is a billionaire. And all of these tweets were calling her like self-made. And then there were all these other tweets being like, she's not self-made, she was born into a life of privilege. And then there were all these other people saying like, what, so you're saying she doesn't work hard? And it's like, you can work really hard, but still have all of these things that are outside of your control, whether they're good or bad, right? There's things out of your control that are helping you. You don't control the color of your skin, and that can help you in, some ways, and that can hurt you in some ways. And you don't control the gender that you're born into, and blah, 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 blah. And there's all these things that we don't control that still have a huge impact on our life, right? But when we kind of look at all the ways that we don't have control, it's terrifying for people, right? So people would rather go, oh, all you need to do is work hard. And if you work hard and, keep your head down, then you are guaranteed to be the best. And it's just not true. But our entire philosophy in the world is kind of built around, if you work really hard, you will be the best, which just isn't true.
Yeah, I don't know too many billionaire ditch diggers, and they work their butts off to the bone every single day. So, we're not even gonna get into that, but in terms of, working hard, work smarter, make the right connections, develop the right habits, there is a recipe that goes into that kind of success. And then you throw in stuff like mental health issues, like you and I have to deal with, and we're entrepreneurs, and we have to juggle all of that and manage a way to service our clients consistently, manage our own self-care, family relationships, personal relationships, and still have this, hopefully not 800-pound gorilla in the room, but something that we can live authentically. And when it's working against us, we got to practice higher self-care. And on our better days, we have to maximize that time so that we can get a lot more done. And it's a roller coaster. You can't predict any of it. So control is really something that we have to make peace with and grieve and say goodbye to, because from one day to the next, you never quite know just what your neurology is going to give you.
And I think that's true, but it's also, see, to me, that runs up against kind of my philosophy around choice, right? Because on the one hand, I'm like, ultimately people don't really have that much control over what goes on in their lives, which I do kind of think is true. And then eventually that bumps up against my belief that, like, even with mental illnesses, I think we all get to make choices.
Absolutely.
And sometimes those feel that they come into conflict, because I don't want anyone to think that, like, oh, I have no control over what goes on in my life, therefore I'm just gonna give up and let the fates decide and go with the flow and that sort of thing. I've been swimming against the stream for the past like 7 years, right? Like, I refuse to go with the flow.
So where do you find that you have the greatest influence when it comes to living in light of these different challenges?
Oh my goodness, that's a big question. I think a lot of it.
Go for it.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is in terms of choosing some of my actions, because a lot of the times I feel like I'm not in control of my thoughts, but I can choose my actions. And sometimes my actions are in direct opposition with my thoughts, right? Like, my thoughts are saying, you're a garbage person, stay inside all day. And like, I have to kind of have that little part of me that's like, okay, well, that may be true, but I'm still going to get dressed and get out of bed today. And, some days that's doable for me and some days that's not, which is, again, where that whole control versus choice sort of debate happens for me. But
So that's a brilliant example of the lizard brain versus the logical brain. Because we have that part of our brain that wants to protect us and keep us safe and plays small. And then we have that more reality testing part of our brain that says, yeah, I hear you, but the facts don't support that. I want to take a risk today, even though you're telling me if you do it, you're going to die.
Yeah. And I think it's sometimes even that logical brain sometimes, isn't always working in my favor. Like, sometimes the logical brain is like, you know what, if you do this, you probably are going to die. But then there's like this like third part of my brain. I don't know where it's coming from, where, like, there's the gut instinct that's saying, don't do this, terror lies there. And then there's the logical part of my brain that's like, don't do it, you'll feel so afraid. And then there's like this little, part in my heart that is just like, well, we're going to do it anyway. Like, let's go, kids. And then they just kind of bring the rest along for the ride.
Now, Tammy said something interesting too. She's a big talker in this thread.
Love it.
Thank you so much, Tammy, for all that wonderful comments. Is she mentioned in terms of the doctors missing the brain-body connection. And what you just pointed to is that our body has multiple sources of wisdom. Our head can be saying one thing, but our heart is saying another, and maybe our gut yet another. So one thing that I know has worked well for me with my meditation and my mindfulness practice is getting into that physical awareness and that knowing to kind of increase my antenna, my barometer of just how the world is. And often my gut is wiser than my brain. Mm-hmm. And being able to tap into those multiple awarenesses can be really, really beneficial. And I don't know about you, but I find that people that have mental illnesses can be much more empathetic and be much more intuitive. And I think that some of that may be hardwired into us from the beginning because we're more sensitive in general. But I think it also kind of evolves because as we seek our own, our own true north or our own center, we discover other wisdoms in our body that help us maintain our sense of direction with an unpredictable neurology. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, from my own experience, I think my own experience living with mental health issues has made me more empathetic, because I've been there, I've walked a mile in their shoes. I think it does depend a little bit on partly on the person as an individual, but also on kind of the experience that person has with regard to their mental health issues, which is, I see this sometimes with people who have struggled with mental health but did not receive the care that they needed, whether it was, medical care or just empathy from other human beings. And sometimes that can really harden them to the point where they, kind of feel like other people should suffer because I suffered as well. I think we see that a lot in kind of nasty Facebook comments on news articles about mental illness or whatever it is, where people are like, oh, in my day, we just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and that's what kids today should do too. And it's like, in your day, you had to suffer in silence. And why would you wish that on someone else? But some people just think, oh, that's the way of the world. And the world is such a harsh and uncaring place. And that just makes me so sad. You know, like how sad is it for someone to live in that world?
And some of the folks that are, you know, in the olden days, we had to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. Some of those folks, and I'm sure you've seen this too, resent those who are getting help and support that they didn't get.
Yes, absolutely.
So they want to try and tell you, you know, you don't deserve it. If I wasn't good enough, you shouldn't be good enough either. And the ones that have been so backed into a corner that they have now believed that life happens to them, that they are victims, they are powerless to create any positive change, and they want to punish the persecutors.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful if they can turn their lives around, but they're not always receptive to do that. You know, we can, like with the work that you do in the schools, you hope that you're speaking to people that are open to receiving the message and receiving the help so they go out and get it for themselves before it's too late.
Yeah. And that's so much my message, especially when I talk to youth, is like, you know, it's like, get help now. You know what I mean? Like, don't wait out 8 years like I did. You know, don't be miserable for the sake of being miserable for 10 years just because you think you're not good enough. Like but it's that vicious cycle, right? Where people are like, I don't feel like I'm good enough to deserve help, so therefore I don't get help, so therefore I continue to feel really bad about myself. And it's kind of showing that cycle to people and showing where they can interrupt it for themselves, right? Because I've lived that cycle. I've been stuck in that cycle. And then my message for teachers so much of the time is like, do not underestimate the influence you can have, right? Because I think sometimes teachers go, well, you know, it's not necessarily my place to be having these conversations about mental health with my students. And I'm like, you're with them 8 hours a day. Like it is absolutely your place. And like, and you you don't have to know everything, you know, you don't have to be an expert in the DSM, but by being a caring adult in a young person's life, that's a huge responsibility, right?
One thing I want everybody to do is give a cyber round of applause to Lee, who is going to begin her MSW, her Master's in Social Work, in a few months here. I've had mine going on 12 years now. I'm such an old fart. But my undergrad internship is I worked for a domestic violence shelter and went into the classrooms to talk about domestic violence and the warning signs. And kids would come up to me afterwards and talk about the violence in their house that they've never talked about before because of the responsibility of keeping the family secret. Yeah. And one of the things that I impressed upon the teachers is after I leave here, they may come and talk to you.
Yeah.
And you've got to know what steps to take should that happen. So you can't really say, well, it's not really my place, because you don't want to take that moment of vulnerability and totally ruin it. You've got to have some sense of where to go with that. So the teachers that say, well, it's really not my place, or they're grateful for your knowledge, how do they tend to respond to you after you give your presentations? Are they like, thanks, Lee, one more thing I have to deal with now? Or is it more accepting than that?
I mean, I'm sure there are some people who like are not happy that I've kind of, you know, cracked the can of worms open or whatever, open that can of worms. But a lot of the times I partner my presentations to the students with presentations to the teachers on the same day because of that exact reason, because I know that students are going to approach their teachers and have these conversations with them. And I want teachers to be equipped because, you know, we're not born knowing the right things to say to someone who's experiencing a mental health issue, right? Like we're not born kind of knowing how to ask directly about suicide and all these sorts of things. So doing those presentations and saying, you know, equipping them with the tools, because I think like 99.9% of people who go into teaching professions are doing it because they're caring people. And that's 99% of the job, right? It's just being that caring adult. But you get bogged down with curriculum and administration and paperwork and all this kind of stuff.
Just getting worse.
And then you just, and you forget, like, and I don't blame them because this happens in so many professions, right? Where people forget the heart that's in it. You know what I mean? Like they say, one of the things they say in like a lot of entrepreneurship circles is, you know, the reason why you got into entrepreneurship and your why should make you cry sort of thing. And I think for a lot of people, you know, who go into caring professions, their why is really deep in their heart, but then it gets bogged down with all that other stuff and they kind of forget. And so they need someone to just kind of pop in and remind them like, this is the impact that a caring adult would have had in my life. This is the impact that, you know, a loving teacher could have had. This is the impact that you immediately today can have on the students in your life. And they just need to be reminded of that. It's not that they don't know it. It just kind of gets forgotten in the day-to-day hubbub.
I can tell you, when I was growing up with all the challenges I had that were not diagnosed during that time, I was depressed all through my youth and through majority of high school. I attempted suicide when I was 15. And a lot of what kept me going all those years, when I was being bullied by peers, when I was being bullied by some of the teachers, was the one professional, whether it was a parent who came into the classroom to help out, whether it was one of my many teachers in middle school, the one person that noticed me and cared and saw me as an individual, sometimes that was enough to keep me going when the rest of the world felt like it had its back turned to me. So never underestimate what you can accomplish as an educator simply by being present. You don't necessarily have to have all the answers, but being able to show up as an authentic human being that just cares, like you said, having that heart and working from that place can be pivotal in a child's life.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a quote that I really like. So it was originally attributed to a Canadian writer named Wesley King, but then I emailed him and he was like, no, that's not my quote. And so I have no idea whose quote it is, but it's an amazing quote. And I end all my presentations off with it. And it said, you know, I cannot unknow the monsters, but I can become the person who would have saved 13-year-old me. And I think that guides so many of our life paths, right? Like that guides my life path. Absolutely. I always joke that, you know, I got into mental health speaking because I am supremely selfish. I just want to go back in time and save myself. And I can't do that. So I just try to save other people instead and teach other people how to save themselves.
Yeah, we can't save our past, but we can absolutely nurture our present and our future.
Yeah.
And so much of what makes us do what we do is because we have that fundamental understanding that life can get better. And we work upon it from here moving forward, and we send the same message to those who we speak to. Regardless of how it's always been, it doesn't mean it has to always be that way.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's one of the more beautiful things that you're doing for the kiddos and the teachers you talk to.
I mean, ideally, that's what I hope I'm doing. It's definitely one of those things where it's always amazing when I have the opportunity to get feedback from students, because I usually stick around after my presentations and like chat with some of the students who I just did my presentation to. And these students live very difficult lives, right? And I think it's one of those things where kind of comes back to that empathy piece. A lot of the times we forget that other people have difficult lives as well, because we get so caught up in our own difficulties. We're like, oh, this is all that's going wrong in my life. Everyone else has it so easy. Look,
yeah, it's all about me, and the universe has sequestered me and made me the outcast. When the more we talk about this, and one thing I don't want to forget is Lee has this fantastic interview show that she does on Saturdays called Crazy Talk. And it's very much like this, you know, the same video interview format. And she had me on a little while ago.
Yeah.
And it too is about getting past that stigma and just talking about what it's like to have these challenges and who you are as a person. And there was something else, but my ADHD brain just kicked in. I wanted to say something else related to that. What were we talking about right before I segued?
I'm like, we were talking about that empathy piece, and we were talking about students live very difficult lives, and we forget that when we're interacting with each other all the time. We forget that other people have struggles just like we do.
Yeah, just the validation that's added to people who are lurking on Facebook, who maybe have these challenges, but think it's just me, you know, nobody else has these same challenges. And then you watch these interviews that Lee does, and like I'm starting to do, that help you realize that this is more universal than you ever realized. This is the human condition. We all suffer, and some of us have labels for our suffering. You know, whether it's bipolar or depression or something else, or you're miserable in your relationship or your job sucks or whatever it is. But it's something that unites us all, that we share in this fact that life is suffering, but life is also hope. Life is also joy. Life is also community. And I don't know what your support system is likely. I imagine that it's got to be pretty stellar for you to be as joyous and delightful as you are. because I know that there are people in my support system that I frankly would not be where I am now without them.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I've been so, so lucky. And so, this sounds so cheesy, but like so truly blessed to have some really incredible people in my life. And I love what you said. It reminded me of the writer Glennon Doyle Melton, although I think just Glennon Doyle now. And she writes about how life is brutal and life is beautiful. And then she calls it life is brutiful, right? Which is cute and adorable and very much, very her. But it's true, life is way more difficult than I ever thought it would be. And life is way better than I ever thought it could be when I started recovering from my mental health issues.
Recovering from, that's an interesting choice of words.
Yeah, so I guess my background's in eating disorders. I was diagnosed with an eating disorder long before I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression and anxiety and all that other good stuff. And so in the eating disorder community, we do talk a lot about recovering from. A lot of the times now I just say living with, I'm living with bipolar disorder, but at the time I was very much recovering from an eating disorder. I don't really engage in therapies that are kind of like, here's how to cure you from being bipolar. But I did at the time engage in a lot of therapies that were like, the idea is to end the eating disorder, right? The idea isn't necessarily with bipolar disorder for it to end. It's about learning to manage it as it, manifests in your life. But with eating disorders in particularly, and when I started recovering almost, 7 years ago, I guess now. So when I kind of started recovering, very much the kind of philosophy that a lot of people have was like, you're not learning to manage your eating disorder. You're trying to eliminate it, basically. So that's where the whole recovering from comes from.
That makes perfect sense to me. Lee, you are phenomenal. I'm so thrilled to know you and what you're doing out there in the world, and that you are furthering your education to make an even greater impact. What is the best way for people to follow you and keep tabs on all the great stuff you're doing?
Yeah, so I do most of my mental health advocacy on my Facebook page. So facebook.com/Lee Thomas Speaks. And you can also find out all sorts of stuff about what I'm doing and sign up for my mailing list and all that good stuff on my website, which is just leethomas.ca.
And feel free to drop those links in the comment thread.
Absolutely,
on my Facebook profile where all this is going on. Those of you who chimed in and made comments and asked questions, thank you so much for watching. If there are people in your life that you think can benefit from this, share generously and keep the conversation going. If you have questions for Lee or for me, type them in the comments and we will get back to you lickety split. And don't forget to find Lee and watch Crazy Talk on Saturdays if you can catch it live. If not, catch the replays. She has some fascinating guests and conversations there as well. Lee, thank you again. This has been an absolute joy.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Brian. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you again, everybody. We'll catch you again real soon. Have an awesome day.